All right, well, it is a blessing to be here with you this morning at Faith Baptist Church, and good to see everyone here. For those that don't know me, my name is Derek Thomas. I grew up here in the Lee Summit area and am a member of the church here, and this is our sending church. We are missionaries to Ukraine and Laos. This is my wife, Julie, now of 38 years. So we just had a anniversary here. I've got to keep updating those numbers. They seem to keep ticking around the clock, don't they? But 38 years. And I know what you're thinking, Brother Derek. You look so young. How can it be 38 years? Is that what you were thinking, Mac? Yes. That's because, Mac, we got married in the 4th grade. That's how that math works out, all right? So, but what a joy to be here with you. And we want to give you an update on what's going on in both Laos and Ukraine, especially Ukraine. And we want to thank you for your faithful prayers and your partnership with us, your gifts, and been so faithful to us. And it's a joy just to have a sending church where we can come back home. There's not a set of drums on the platform and a bass guitar. I'm excited about that. Amen. Pastor's beard's a little, on the edge there, but everything else is good here, right? Are we good with the beard, Candace?
It was worse yesterday.
It's better today. And talking about prayer cards, how many would vote Candace needs a prayer card? How many would say amen to that? All right. I think that's right. It's very great, yeah. All right. Well, hey, we have in our ministry, as some of you would know, when we got to Ukraine, a Ukrainian pastor came to me and said, Brother Derek, I have a contact in Laos, and I've gone to some churches here in Ukraine, but the Ukrainian churches really don't seem to understand what we've got there. They're not as interested. And then he said, someone had told me to come speak to you. Would you come with me to Laos? And listen, I had never been to Southeast Asia, to South Asia in any way. And people there come up to about my 2nd or 3rd rib right here on my side. So it was a completely new experience. But I went with him. And through that, the Lord began the Lao Bible Institute. And we rejoice in the ministry there. And we're going to share here a little bit about that with you. We're going to see here if I've got this. Yes, I've got this on. And anything? Maybe if I move closer this way. All right, you want to give me there we go. Did you do that or did I do that? Okay, so we'll have to go that. There is the 1040 window, all right? Everybody know what the 1040 window is, the 10 and 40, the longitude, but it goes across northern Africa to the Middle East, over into Central Asia. If you look up there, Kazakhstan, that's where all the stand guys are, Uzbekistan and so forth, all the way down into South Asia, India, and then into Southeast Asia, where you can see there Thailand all the way to Vietnam. Wedged in between Thailand and Vietnam is Laos. But that area represents the majority of our unreached world. So there's about 4.65 billion people that live in that window right there, and they are considered 95% unreached with the gospel. So unreached does not mean that 5% have been reached, that they're saved. It means 5% have the potential to hear the gospel, but 95% of people who live in that window have no potential to hear the gospel. They'll go from cradle to grave. They'll never once hear about the love of God, the forgiveness of God, the grace of God through faith in Jesus Christ. So that's the largest part of our unreached world. There's about 8.1 or 2 billion people in the world, so 4.65, almost 5 billion. You can see that's the majority of our world that is unreached. All right, it's working. So, right, or did you do that? You did it again? Oh, all right. So every time I click, you just click and I'll think it's working. All right. It's a unique system you got here, Pastor, at the church. So right there you see Thailand there to the west, and Vietnam to the east. Down to the south there is Cambodia. To the north is China, and also up there to the northwest, Myanmar. But that is where the country is located. Of course, if you followed the Vietnam War at all back in that day, not many of us here, a few of us here, right, would remember Vietnam. But Laos was involved with that, and all that was going on during that time, and was impacted by the war in a terrible way. There's still people finding bombs that had been dropped there that had not gone off in mines and so forth there. But up to the north, China has a major footprint in that entire region. They are working in many different ways. They've just built a train that goes all the way through Laos. So there's actually 2 stops in Laos, up in the mountains there in a city called Luang Prabang, and then in Vientiane, the capital. It goes all the way down to Bangkok. So now it's possible to go by train into China from Laos. But that gives you a little bit of a feel for it. Good job. So there you see one of 5 communist countries in the world. And you can see the other ones there, of course, China and North Korea. You've got Cuba, you've got Vietnam, and you've got Laos. So communism there is, of course, it's very controlling, very restricted when you are there. You'll see the communist flags in Laos as you travel there. There you see a Buddhist stupa, it is called. The stupa is a part of where they consider part of Buddha's body has been buried in the stupa. So Buddhists go there to worship. The majority of Laotian people would be Buddhist, all right? So you can see a temple there. You see Buddhism everywhere you go. I've been out in the country. You'll see huge Buddhas. You know, of course, they pray to these Buddhas. And it's Buddhism really doesn't answer the question about where did I come from and where am I going. Buddhism is more concerned about where you are right now and reaching this place of nirvana, of peace, inner peace and tranquility here in life. So, but people are Buddhism is very organized, and I would say a Buddhist is one of the harder people to reach with the gospel. I think a Hindu is easier to reach with the gospel than a Buddhist, because Hinduism, not very much order, but Buddhism, very, very ordered, very structured in their faith. But in Laos, there's 126 different people groups. So the Laotian people are just one of the people groups. They're the largest of the people groups. But then you've got other people groups, for example, like the Hmong people. And of course, if you followed the Vietnam War, the Hmong fought with America and the Americans. But the Hmong people, there are 3 types of Hmong people. So there are the green Hmong, there are white Hmong, there are black Hmong. Now, it's not by their skin color, but it's just these are the tribal groups, and each one has its own language. And they don't even understand themselves between the languages. So the languages are that different. But the Hmong people would be what they call animists. You know what animism is? Animism is the worship of spirits. So if it could be the Mekong River. The Mekong River has a spirit. It could be that rock. It could be the mountain. It could be an animate or inanimate object. It could be the chicken in your backyard. But these spirits will come to you in your dreams. They call these spirits demons. Isn't that interesting? Which is a pretty accurate portrayal of what they are. But the demon comes to you in your dream, and then if you want the blessing from that spirit, you have to do what that spirit told you to do. So you would have that dream, and it's the satanic activity there, as you can imagine, is very heightened in areas like that. And so if you have a dream at night from the spirit that visited you, the next day you would go to see your we'll call him a witch doctor there in the village, and you'll explain to him your dream, and then he'll tell you if you correctly interpreted it or not. He might add something to it that you need to do if you want the blessing from that spirit. But can you imagine living, if you thought this is how the world really works, can you imagine living under that? And so the majority of the other 126 or so people groups are animist. So they're animistic in their thinking, and there's villages, animist villages. They're very Eastern-minded in their thinking, so very collective and very, very hard. Sometimes a person, if you leave that village or that mindset, if you leave animism or Buddhism from the Eastern collective mindset, community-driven again, you will be persecuted, not maybe by the communist government, you'll be persecuted by your own people. They will want you out of the village. They will burn your home. I mean, even family members that have gotten saved and what they do to their own family because they became Christian, because they left the group. See, here in America, we are Western-minded, very independent in our thinking, which has its negatives, right? Because we see people hopping around from church to church. Well, bless God, I'll just go to another church, right? Do we have that mindset here in America? I know I've seen it here. So, but in that other mindset, you don't just leave the community. So on a positive side, in churches, that works as a positive. But for communities where people are getting saved, that can be difficult. Now, if you work in a factory, let's say in Vientiane, and you're working in the factory and the Buddhist works next to you in the factory, you have to be very prayerful and wise about how you witness to the person. You wouldn't just come to them first time you met them, just give them a tract and say, bless God, you're going to hell if you believe in Buddhism. You need to convert to Christianity, because that person could take you and turn you in to the director, boss. That boss contact the police. Police will be there that day to arrest you and take you to jail, because that's illegal. You're not allowed to preach the gospel that freely. Now, if you get to know them a little bit, and you begin to learn how you can speak to them, you can share the gospel with them. I'm just saying, pastors do it. In our institute there, one time I asked, how many of you have spent time in prison for your faith? About 40% of their hands went up in the air. So they're not afraid to be persecuted, and they'll preach the gospel, get in trouble for that, and there are Christians that do. But I'm just saying, it's not the freedom that we have here in America. Just we're protected. We have our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and so forth. You don't have those protections in a communist country. All right. So here you see our Bible Institute, and we have somewhere between 50 and 70 men that come per session. And again, they come from all over the country. I shared earlier about the number of people groups, 126, 127. We have about 9 different people groups represented in our institute. So pray with us that God would give us one servant to train from each of the people groups, all right? One laborer to train to reach their people. Of those 126 people groups, it's, I think, these are considered 76% unreached with the gospel. So again, it doesn't mean 24% have been reached. It means 24% have the potential to meet a Christian or to attend a church in their area of some kind, gospel preaching church, but 76% will have no potential to do that. But we are seeing some of our guys and seeing the gospel going into areas, into villages where the gospel has never been before. And for me, that's one of the most exciting things that happen when I get a report they went to a village where the gospel has not been preached. And it's so exciting. There you see a picture from a recent session that we had. And again, we rejoice. That's our new building, which I'm going to share with you about in just a moment. There you see the blue dot. That is Vientiane, the capital. And where the blue dot is, that is the center of Vientiane. And the Lord provided a lot there that we purchased for around $95,000. A couple of months after we purchased the lot, we were offered $250,000. And that was without even marketing it or trying to sell it. That was just someone come and said, hey, we'll buy this from you and give you $250,000. And we were tempted to sell and then take that money and go build something larger outside the city. But thought, man, if we leave the center, we're never getting back to the center. This is about a 10-minute, 15-minute walk from the central bus station. So, I mean, you were right in the heart of the city. And the location God gave us was just, it's really been amazing. It was of the Lord. It was Lord answering prayers. I wish I could say I prayed faithfully and fervently, but I know the men over there were praying, and I think God really gave us a wonderful, wonderful spot. And here's the next picture here is the building that God gave us. So it's 3 stories. On the first floor, pastor and his wife live. On that second floor, we have some classrooms, and also in that back, we have a large room that we can seat. I think they had a youth conference there. Was it 2 or 250 kids? Now they were going out into the foyer area and around. They couldn't all be seated because technically what we're doing is illegal by the letter of the law. And then up above that 3rd story, you can see it's open. So we have guys, that's where guys will stay, sleep. We have a ping pong table, some things up there for them to do. But I would just say this, our building that God gave us, and the national pastor there that I work with, he's used this word, I believe, multiple times now. He said this is a miracle, and it really is. It's a miracle of God's grace, how God provided, how the building, where it's located at the end of a cul-de-sac, that we can have that many people there. They're getting ready to hold, I believe, a national missions conference there in the building. And in fact, that I believe starts tomorrow night, Monday night. And I think they're expecting, do you remember, did you hear, it was 150 or 200 people anyway at that. And we're hoping, pray with us, we're hoping the first quarter of next year to begin a church here. Right now, the pastor that lives there and that we're planning to start the church with, he right now is pastoring 3 other churches. In one of those churches, we're trying to transition to a new pastor. And so once that takes place, which I think that's going to happen here fairly soon, then we will begin the work in the center of Vincennes. So pray with us about that, and pray for the Lao Bible Institute. Pray for laborers. Pray for God to give us. We have the 9 different people groups. Pray again for God to give us, what would that be, 100 and, you're good at math, Randy, 118 other people groups that to come in that we could train to send on. So pray for the country of Laos. All right, if you didn't get a prayer card, we have some back there on the back table for Ukraine. We also have a sign-up sheet on the back table if you'd like to get our email updates or video updates that we give, but we would welcome you to do that. Here you see a young girl with the colors of the Ukrainian flag in the heart. Anybody know what those colors stand for? Huh? Yeah, the colors. What are they for? Yes, the sky and the sunflowers, the harvest. Ukraine is one of the richest farmlands in all the world. In fact, if you Google richest farmland, Ukraine will come right up at the top. It's one of the leading producers of grains in the world. And as you travel through there, I mean, you'll see just everything, but you'll see corn, you'll see different types of wheat and so forth there. They have been called the breadbasket of Europe. But in Soviet times, they were called the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, been called the breadbasket of Europe, and even the breadbasket of the world. And it's been amazing during the war how much they have been able to produce during this time. There have been fields I drive by in eastern Ukraine, we've driven by, where they can't plant because they were mined by the Russians. You know, the Russians try to destroy or to hinder their harvest in any way they can, because they know that's the primary way that Ukraine derives income. Down in Odessa, where they'll have the big bins of the harvest that they'll have there to ship out through the Black Sea, they'll hit those bins, they'll try to take those out, anything that they can do to limit the harvest. But really, there's 2 people in Ukraine that I think are feared mostly by the Russians. One is the grandmothers, the babushkas. Because man, they are some tough women over there, I want to tell you for sure. And I've ridden on the subway system with them in Kyiv, and don't step in front of a grandmother. You'll get an elbow right in your middle rib right here. They're tough women over there. And then, but the other is the Ukrainian farmer, the farmer. And you've seen pictures, or you'll see things with using their tractors to pull the Russian tanks out of the way. They've got T-shirts even over there of this, but they continue to farm even through very difficult and dangerous times. There's even been snipers that have been out to shoot Ukrainian farmers. So God has blessed and allowed them to get a majority of the crop out, much more than I thought was possible to take place. There you see the capital city of Kyiv. Anybody know how old Kyiv is? Almost as old as Brother Ashbaugh, all right? Oh, all right. It is about 1,800 to 2,000 years old, all right? 1,800 to 2,000 years old. You're okay, right, Bob? Okay. We're still friends, right? Well, he always tells me his head, that's how we're all going to look in heaven, because he has a glorified head. I said, well, your head might be glorified, but your brain isn't, right, Brother Bob? So about 1,800 to 2,000 years old, and there's a saying that Kyiv is the mother of Moscow. So Moscow is about 500 to 700 years younger than Kyiv. So Kyiv was started on the Dnepr River as a trade route by the Vikings. That's where it had its beginnings, and then it just grew from there. About 5 million people in the greater metropolitan area. So it's a beautiful ancient city to see in a place where Julie and I called home before the war began. Here you see the original reason that we went to Ukraine was for the Slavic Baptist Institute, which was begun in 1996 by Dr. Neil Cadwell. In fact, Brother Cadwell and I met while I was pastoring here, and he asked if I would consider following him there because his health was failing. And I prayed about it, and for a temporary period, I continued to pastor while I would travel over there, but then just felt the Lord leading to move there, that was His will. And we rejoice in the graduates from SBI, how they're serving today, and also current students and how God is using them during a time of war. Just last week, was it last week, we had a session there of our institute. Julie and I were not there. It was completely national-led, national teachers, and that's really our goal, is to get the nationals involved so that they're doing the work. Because what would happen if Russia did take the country and you could not get back into the country? We'll talk a little bit here in just a moment what Russia is doing in the occupied territories of Ukraine. But we're very grateful for the Institute. There you see a map of Ukraine right before the war began, and in February of 2022. And you saw the soldiers amassing, Russian soldiers on that eastern side. Note Kharkiv there. That is the second largest city on the eastern side of Ukraine, and we have a lot of activity, evangelistic activity going on there. But that you can see where they came in from the Black Sea, that the striped peninsula there, Crimea, was actually occupied by Russia in 2014, as well as that Donetsk area there, that Donbass area, was occupied. Really, the war between Ukraine and Russia has been going on since 2014. But pretty much, if you were in country, you could not tell that there was a war going on. I mean, if you were in Kiev, you never heard sirens, you never heard explosions. The only thing you would maybe see is soldiers traveling through the train station to get down to the war. So the war was pretty much isolated to those areas. But in February 24th of 2022, that's when this major invasion took place, and they came in. Now, I'm not sure that they actually came in from that side towards Odessa, but they did come in from the east, and they did come down from Belarus. You saw Russian soldiers, massive numbers, crossing over into Belarus, and they came right down on top of Kyiv on that date. And everything changed. From then, everyone knew that they were in a war. And now you see pictures like this. You know, if you were to remove the color, you would think you were looking at pictures from World War II, and sometimes the devastation is really that great. This is a maternity ward in Mariupol that was hit by a Russian missile. Both this lady and her baby were killed in that attack, and many of the targets of the Russians are civilian targets. In fact, I recently saw a statistic like of 2,000 missiles and drones that were fired by Russia into Ukraine. Only 5% of them were fired at military targets. 95% were at civilian targets. So you've got hospitals that are being hit. You have schools. I think 2,000 schools have been hit. You've got children's hospitals that have been hit. You've got apartment buildings that have been hit. And there's somewhere around 14 million Ukrainians that have been displaced from their homes. And so you hit an apartment building like this, I mean, that might be 500, 1,000 people, you know, right there that have been displaced from their homes in one shot. This is an apartment building in Kyiv. Julie and I happened to be there this morning. I was not in this apartment. We were in our apartment. I was in my office getting ready for Sunday morning services, and I heard the explosions, and I looked out through my window up and toward the center of Kyiv, and I could see the smoke coming up in the center of Kyiv. So you just never know when it's going to be targeted, where they're coming. You hear, again, the sounds all the time. So, but of the 14 million that have been displaced, 1.2 million of those are children. And children are really paying the greatest cost in Ukraine during this war. I mean, it's having devastating effects on children. This home, next one here, is the pastor's home in Kherson. His home was hit there by a Russian drone. And this picture right here is his granddaughter. She happened to be in the home when it hit, and you can see there she lost her left leg in that attack. And so just things like this that children are faced with in Ukraine because of the war. This little boy here, his name is Marcus. They estimate that 1.5 million Ukrainian children already have PTSD. And for most of them, they say it will be generational. It's going to be something they're going to have their entire lives. Now, if you know anybody with PTSD, with Christ, it's a struggle, right? But without Christ, it's impossible. And so it's just hard to imagine. But if you're there, even on short trips like Julie and I take there, and you hear the sirens and you hear the explosions, I mean, you know, if you put your child to bed at 8 or 9 o'clock, and then at 11 or 12 o'clock, sirens are going off, I mean, you have to make a decision. Do I take my child, wake him up? Do we go down, you know, 10 stories, 10 flights stories in our building to get to the bomb shelter down below? You know, do I take the elevator? Electricity might go off, you know, and I mean, you're faced with all these things. And then once you get down there, okay, is it now safe? The all safe comes. You go back upstairs, you put your child to bed again. And then what happens if about 5 in the morning, the same thing happens again? So you can imagine what this would do to a child's psyche and what it's doing to many people there. I mean, the war is now almost 3 years old. I mean, it's going to be there, we're 2 years, 10 months right now. So very soon, it'll be 3 years. So if you can imagine this just going on and on and on like this, but very, very difficult on children. But with when the night is the darkest, the light is what? The light is the brightest, and we have a charitable fund called Compassion for Ukraine. And by God's grace, we're trying to make a difference there in Ukraine. This summer, we brought children over from eastern Ukraine, primarily from that Kharkiv area, very close to where the war is taking place. And we staffed our camp with SBI students and staff. And Compassion for Ukraine paid for the kids to travel there. Now, these children are coming from lost families. So these are not children coming from churches. These are children coming from lost families, and we're able to minister. Julie and I got to be a part of a couple of weeks of camp there. We did 3 different camps, but what a wonderful time it was to be there with them, just to love on them, but mostly to share the hope of Christ with them. And in the next picture here, we had decisions that were made during these camps, and we rejoice in decisions that were made. Children were very open to hear and to listen, and we praise God for that and for our staff and the workers there at the camp, and just for God's blessing. Pray for us. We have one coming up in January that Compassion for Ukraine is going to pay for, and so pray again for our staff, for the kids that will be coming. Some of these children come from areas where there are no churches, so there are even Bible clubs that are starting. And we have one guy that's just been very good. He goes to these areas, and again, these areas are not super safe areas, but he'll go in there, he holds these Bible clubs, and it's just neat to see how God has used this for the glory of his name. Here you see a map of Ukraine up in the upper left where the star is Lutsk. And that is where our fund is located. That's where the camp is located. And from there, we'll receive aid. So like we have a container, a 40-foot container that's en route right now to Ukraine. We'd receive that container through Poland. We'll have to go pick it up in Lublin, and then we'll bring it over to Lutsk. Mac, we need a driver. Do you want to be a driver? Bring that into Ukraine for me? Oh, thanks. And then we'll bring it in, and we can unload the trailer there. And then from there, we distribute the aid primarily through our network of churches affiliated with SBI. So it's, for example, if you go over there to the right side, the east side of Ukraine, you see Poltava. We would send them a shipment to the church in Poltava. They would receive the aid, break it down into boxes or bags. Then they will go off into areas even closer to the war, and there they will distribute the aid and share the gospel of Christ. Now, look at this picture and then go back one picture for me. And I want you to notice that red. Now, do you see where the red was? And do you see where the line where the distribution is taking place? The reason we don't go past that line is because this right here is where Russia occupies Ukraine. And it might be a little bit more than this now, but it's somewhere around 20% of Ukraine is occupied by Russia. But here's what's interesting and what's really terrible news. I mean, in that occupied area, they have had about 20,000 children, and this is a very conservative number, 20,000 children taken from their parents and shipped into Russia, to camps in Russia, and even given to Russian parents to take them. Now, can you imagine? Now, how would you get from there to go get your child or even try to find your child? But about 20,000 that has happened to. Also in that occupied territory, about 400 to 500 evangelical churches have been closed by Russia. Most of those would be Baptist churches. So 400 to 500 be closed. And they would say something like this. Russia would say this. This is now Russia. And if you're Russian Orthodox. That's what a true Russian is. They're Russian Orthodox. This is what they're saying. And your religion is a religion from the West. And you're bringing dogma in through your religion. You are no longer allowed to meet. And there have been pastors. I just read recently of a pastor who was beaten until blood was coming out of his ears and so forth. They're arrested and all. So that's what's happening in occupied Ukraine. Just to give you a feel, even a woman who had her nails painted the colors of the Ukrainian flag, the blue and the gold, she was arrested for having her nails painted that color. If you wear a traditional Ukrainian embroidered vyshyvanka shirt as a male, it's a sign of, again, Ukrainian nationalism or Ukrainian pride. If you were to wear something like that, be arrested in those areas. So there's no freedom there. Very, very difficult there for what's going on there. All right. Here you can see that Compassion for Ukraine, that we've helped to distribute about 16 million pounds of aid since the war began in February of 2022. Go back one slide there for me. And there you can see about 950,000 New Testaments. So we're going to talk about New Testaments in just a moment and how people just receive them so easily. But that's a little bit about what God has been able to do. Listen, I'm not Franklin Graham and this is not Samaritan's Purse, but I did feel that this is, in a way, through another guy that had spoken to me, that this was what the Lord wanted us to do at this time. And we just marvel at God's provision and how He has provided in so many different ways. There you can see a load of aid that we can still buy in country. We recently just bought one of these. It's about $7,000. It will feed about 600 people for 3 weeks. On this load, you can see there's some canned meats. There'll be grains, different types of pastas, oil, water. Some of the places we go to, they don't have water. We just sent the most recent load we purchased, went down to Kherson, which is a very dangerous area, south on the Dnepro River. The Russians are just across the river on the other side. But more than just feeding 600 people for 3 weeks is the opportunity it brings to share the gospel. Here you can see a young lady. She's got a box of aid there with Compassion for Ukraine sticker. On top of her box is a couple of New Testaments. I happen to be here at this meeting, so when we come into an area like this, we would say something like this, might say something like this: hello, we're here today to give aid in the name of Jesus Christ, but before we give you the aid, we want to tell you something greater that Christ has done for you. And you go into about a 25-minute gospel presentation and share with them the hope of Christ. That, listen, they've heard of Christ, right? Most of them are Orthodox. They think of themselves as Christians, but Orthodox is kind of like a Catholic. I mean, you have to work your way to God. I mean, yes, Christ died, but that's not enough. I've got to do my part, right? I've got to keep sacraments. I have to keep traditions and so forth to earn God's favor. So you're coming in here and you're telling them about grace. You're challenging them with the thought, man, you must be born again. It's just not knowing Christ up here with your head. It's receiving Him down here with your heart and receiving a changed life through Him. Sometimes when you're preaching, you might hear sirens going off. Julie has her phone connected to Kyiv, so when Kyiv, in fact, we were just this morning, her phone was going off, but it makes like the Amber Alert sound that your phone will make. Well, it makes that sound in Ukraine. That sound in Ukraine means you're in an area where missiles are potentially coming or drones are coming. So there have been times when you're preaching, you'll hear phones going off in the room, you'll hear sirens even from the outside the building, even missiles that are hitting maybe 5 or 7 miles away, you'll hear the little booms in the distance. So people there know that life is short. They know that life is temporary. They know that death is imminent. And so they're truly searching for answers. They want to know what you believe and why you believe. So they are listening intently. As we give out New Testaments, as I shared, almost everybody takes them. It's rare that you would be turned down. This was the last trip in that we made in August. I was with some soldiers. Some of these were getting ready to go to the front lines. And we were able to share the gospel with them, and we had camouflaged New Testaments to give to them. And again, it was just very, very well received. We've had groups as large as this, which was about 1,000 people in Kharkiv area. And I just, when are you able to preach the gospel to 1,000 people? I mean, before the war, in fact, in 2018, I don't know if you know Couriers for Christ, but they came over, they brought a group over, and we did evangelism in Kyiv. I think we gave out somewhere around 50,000 John Romans and invitations for an evangelistic meeting in Kyiv, and we had around 150 people that came to 2 different meetings. So that many invitations and John Romans, 50,000, and only about 150 people. But here, this is just word of mouth. You've got instantly 1,000 people that you get to preach the gospel to. And it's just a very unique opportunity. This was a group up in north of Kharkiv. This is about 8 miles from the Russian border. This group was somewhere around 1,200 to 1,500 people. Again, you get to preach the gospel to them. We have a young lady who plays the violin. And then this is Vitaly right here. He's part of our staff for SBI. He has a beautiful baritone voice. He was singing. And then she'll come back up, Albina, play the violin, and then you get to preach the gospel. Sometimes you'll see tears coming down faces, and they've already been touched by hearing the music and so forth, and then you get to share with them the hope of Christ. From this group, a church started. Can you believe that? So right now we can say in Ukraine, we have more people hearing the gospel than at any time before. We have more people that respond to the gospel than any time before. I mean, in the different groups, whether it be a group of 50 or 70 or 100 or the larger groups, if you'll ask who just prayed that prayer to receive Christ, you might have 30-40% of the hands go up in the air that they just prayed. So you have more response to the gospel. Thirdly, right now, we're seeing more churches started than at any time since I've been in Ukraine. So who would have thought that that was possible during a time of war? I certainly didn't. I remember sitting in my office in Kyiv before the invasion took place, but it looked imminent, and thinking, well, what can you even do in a country during war, right? I mean, how can there be any ministry here during war? But God showed me what I know and what He knows, and how God uses all things for good and for His glory. But He is. This was, again, our last trip in, and the groups and the crowds continue to come. And some of these groups we've been to now multiple times. This happened to be a new group for me. I'd never been to this area before, exact area. This was an area up even closer to the Russian border, I think somewhere around 4 miles to the Russian border, north of Kharkiv. What was unique about this area was not the size of the group, but was the fact that, the best we know, this was the first time the gospel was ever preached here publicly. And I've had multiple opportunities in Ukraine to speak in other areas where, the best they know, that was the first time the gospel was ever preached in this village or in this area. So right now you got more people hearing the gospel, more responding, more churches being started. And oh yeah, by the way, we're seeing the gospel going into areas of Ukraine where it's never been before. Now again, I don't know how it's possible. I don't know how it's happening. I'm just telling you, we've made 11 trips in, and this is what God is doing right now in Ukraine. There's our church. It's called Living Hope Baptist Church. This is when we were meeting there in the hotel. And before the war, we had 2 services on Sunday. We had a Ukrainian service and an international service. Our international service, we had many international students. We were not far from the dormitory there. So we had them from India, China, Africa, all over the world that were coming. And we had some even Americans that lived and would come to the church there. But then when the war began, the invasion there in 2022, all the international folks fled, they left. Even Ukrainians that left, we really just only had a handful of people that were left. And early on, Kyiv looked like it was going to be taken, if you remember. They were coming down from the northwest. They were coming down from the northeast. It didn't look good. But by a miracle of God's grace, Russia pulled back. And I don't think anybody knows why that happened. I'd like to think it was the finger of God that stopped them. But they removed and went back to southeast Ukraine, where the focus is on right there. We restarted services in Ukraine. The majority of people that you see there are coming from Orthodox church background. Now, there's the Ukrainian Orthodox and there's Russian Orthodox, and they're considered 2 separate churches, but the message is the same. It's works-based salvation, but it's very traditional. The heritage you have, almost like Catholicism, it's very important. You know, my grandmother was Orthodox, my great-grandmother. I mean, this for generations, this is who we've been. And I mean, you could invite Orthodox people to church before the war, and you would see, I would say I would see more than I would see if I was in a Catholic country come to visit. But it wasn't something that happened very often, and it would be maybe one, that you might have come on a Sunday, 1 or 2. But here you see a room filled with Orthodox people coming. And not only are they coming, but they're responding. And these took their icons off the wall. They took them back to the Orthodox Church and left them there. They said they didn't feel right about just throwing them in the trash. But they took them back to the church, and they came and they followed the Lord in believers' baptism. So you see things like this that are happening in decisions, and I know there's a lot of decisions being made, but some of these are some true decisions of God's grace and God's work in hearts and lives. There's Dima. He pastors the church there in Kyiv now. We ordained him. He is now the pastor. And so he is doing a wonderful job. Dima and Erica, that's his wife Erica, they had a baby recently born named Oscar. Oscar has DeGeorge syndrome and had to have open heart surgery when he was born, and was in the hospital, Children's Hospital in Kyiv, the night it was hit by a hypersonic missile. Believe it or not, hypersonic missile means 5 times the speed of sound. One of their most, latest, greatest that Russia has to fire. So they knew what they were firing at when they hit the Children's Hospital. Dima wrote me, he said, Oscar's hospital's been hit. I don't know if he's dead or alive. And a couple hours later, he wrote, Oscar is alive. And so pray for them. Not too long ago, he wrote me that there were drones. They now live in our apartment where Julie and I lived. There were drones flying over the apartment. A drone would sound almost like a motorcycle up in the air that was going over the apartment. He heard it got taken out right near the building by air defense. Those were hit in explosions, if you can imagine there. So pray for them, and we rejoice in them and what God is doing. Also pray with us as a property has become available, and we're supposed to be putting a deposit on that this week, and later this month we'll be making our first major payment on the property, but it's very close to where we are right now. We're renting a storefront, but prices are a little bit lower right now because of the war. When the war ends, which some would say it'll happen the first half of next year, possibility of it ending, they already have, Ukraine does, a route towards membership in the EU. Now I'm not saying NATO, but free Ukraine, I think, will join the EU. I think that's kind of a no-brainer and will be done when there's peace. But if they do join the EU, prices are going to go up very high. So we're trying to buy right now while prices are low and before they get out of reach for us. So pray with us about that, just for God's will concerning the new property. This is a pastor by the name of Evgeny. He's also a graduate of SBI. We ordained him earlier this year. He's over in the Kharkiv area. He had started a church there in Kharkiv. And I've been out on evangelistic meetings with him, and they'll go out and you just have these groups of people that gather. And again, you just have this 15, 20, 25-minute window to preach to them the hope of Christ. They recently had a service there. They celebrated 3 years since he started the church, and they had 200 in the service. So pretty amazing what God is doing. I've been there. So you see the group there directly in front of you, and to the left over here, there's more area over here. But what's even more exciting to me about about where they're meeting is that this is a former bar. So emphasis on former, all right? But former bar. The bar is right behind you. If you're preaching there, you can kind of see the edge of the stand there that you preach from. But right behind you is the bar, former bar. But you know what we could say right now in Ukraine? We have bars that are becoming churches. Now in America, we have churches becoming bars, don't we? But there we have bars becoming churches. And so it's really been amazing to see. This is the city of Kherson. We have a very faithful pastor here. Earlier, Kherson had been occupied by Russia. And it was occupied for 6, 7 months, 8 months, but later was freed by the Ukrainian army. The Russians were pushed back across to the south part of the Dnipro River. So during the time of occupation and so forth, you can imagine how difficult it was there. But this pastor never left. He stayed. You can see when they were able to fully restart services, they now have 400 on Sundays. Now that's amazing. And again, majority of these are lost people that are coming. I wanted to share a testimony about this young lady right here. Her name is Hannah. And Hannah is 78 years old. Best we know, she had never heard the gospel before the war. But now she got to hear the gospel during the war. I want you to hear what it meant for her to hear the gospel, okay? This is her testimony we translated into English. My life has been completely changed. I understood that the end of life was close and it was frightening for me. Now I know that I'm held in the hands of a loving Heavenly Father and I will always be with Him. The fear of death has passed. All that remains is the expectation of meeting Him. Isn't that wonderful? So you can imagine how you would live under that fear of death, right? Hearing the sirens, hearing the explosions, reading daily or even hearing daily of people that were killed that night. So I praise God for her. Praise God for that pastor right there, Alek, for his faithfulness, that he stayed. He did not leave. He could be in Western Ukraine. He could be in the West. He could be in America today if he really wanted to. But he chose to stay and make full proof of his ministry. And I am thankful for such men that are doing that. I don't judge those that have left. That's between them and the Lord. And I know for many it's protecting their families. But how thankful I am for someone like this. Let me ask you this question. Do you think Hannah is grateful that Pastor Alek stayed? Yeah, and I bet the church members he has, I bet they're also very thankful that he stayed. This was his car a few days. I just saw him in August, met him and saw him in August. But this was his car hit by a Russian drone a few days after I met with him. But he is fine. He continues to preach. The gospel is continuing to go out. And it's just amazing, amazing to see. This is a group of about 800 people that waited 2 hours in line for one loaf of bread. Can you imagine? But that day, they got to hear about the bread of life. So we would just ask that, go ahead and give me the next one here, that you would pray for Ukraine and pray for these pastors like Alek, like Pastor Nikolai, like Pastor Evgeny, and so forth, that are living in very dangerous areas to continue ministering to people there. Pray for pastors like Dima, who live Kyiv would be a little bit safer, but it's still dangerous. They're choosing to stay. Pastors like in Poltava, safer area, it's still dangerous, they still get attacked, but then they choose to take aid and go closer to where the war is. So pray for their protection. Pray for power for these men, that as they take the gospel out, the power to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. Number 3, pray for peace. Pray for God to bring peace to Ukraine. We're hoping that this peace, by His grace, will come, and the new administration in America, I think, will help to be a part of that. We're hoping. But pray that God will bring an end to the war soon. And then number 4, pray for provision, all right? Provision for compassion for Ukraine. Our monthly budget's been running somewhere around $20,000-$25,000 a month. And God has just provided in many different ways. We were in a little church down in Arkansas, and on a Sunday night, maybe there were 70, 80 people there on a Sunday night, and this church didn't support us. This was our first time ever there, and the pastor was asking me questions and what our needs were, what our budget was, and so forth. And a few weeks later, he contacted me, said, "Brother Derek, we're going to give you $40,000 for Compassion for Ukraine." My first question was, "Pastor, do you have any friends down there?" You Arkansas guys have been holding out on us, right? I didn't know you guys had that much money down there. So, no, but just things like that God has done and how God provides. And so please pray with us that God will continue providing. We're hoping to continue to do, like Julie and I right now are here. We're traveling to raise funds, for Compassion for Ukraine. But we still have guys. The aid is still going out. We still have our director, Sergey, organizing and doing things there. We still have guys taking the gospel out and preaching it. We would covet your prayers, and especially for those that have yet to hear the gospel, that they may hear the message of Christ, all right, and the hope of Christ. And so we rejoice in that, and we thank you for your prayers, again, in your partnership. We ask that you would please continue, all right? Well, let's have a word of prayer right now for Ukraine, and we will close, and for God's work in Ukraine and for pastors there in Ukraine. I'm going to ask Brother Ken, if he would, to close us in prayer and pray for Ukraine. Brother Ken, just ask God to bless and use it for His glory. All right, my brother?